Hello, everyone. I wanted to spend a little bit more of time after having given those kinship lectures talking about a very specific kind of kinship that I didn't address much, but which was central to the reading, which is marriage. This meme jokingly says, marriage lets you annoy one special person for the rest of your life, which is, of course, a joke, one hopes. But I hope you found the Love in Four Cultures reading interesting. As you read through it, I'm not just going to sort of review the reading. I'll expect that you've done it, but I want you to think about some questions as you have done that reading. With the Nemakat village example from Papua New Guinea, what was the sort of prerequisite for marriage and why was that important? I thought it was very interesting sort of how the marriage began, right? With two people sneaking off, being discovered by the families, and then sort of almost, well, now it's time for marriage, which can sound like sort of what sometimes gets called a shotgun wedding in the United States. But we need to understand it through a cultural relativism lens. And that's what you see with the person that's in the audience saying, oh, this is how my marriage began. And she's like, crying happy tears. Sneaking off together in this particular culture is sort of a pretext for when people are getting to the stage of marriage and readiness to be married. There's the story, of course, of Esther among the Maasai. This story thinking about the motivations of the different people involved, including both Esther and her father. It's also, I think, a good example of how we can use cultural relativism to understand the motivations, and that does not mean we have to approve of the motivations. I personally strongly disagree with sort of coercively telling someone who they should marry, or else, so to speak, but that doesn't mean I can't use cultural relativism to better understand how the culture views that practice. I can still disagree strongly with it. So cultural relativism, again, doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as moral relativism, and we can understand when something is, from our ethical point of view, wrong, while still, as anthropologists, trying to better understand how that cultural practice came to be and how it's understood. The case of the Mayandi in Tamil Nadu in India, right? I thought was a really interesting example of a practice we'll talk about in a minute called cross-cousin marriage. And then finally, the example of Scotland probably resonated with a lot of people as sort of a good example of what we sometimes call companionate marriages, or to be more brief about it, love marriages. What we see across cultures is that essentially every culture has ideas of romantic love that is not sort of unique to one culture or another. In some cultures, that is considered to be the foundational basis for why people get married. And I would say in much of the United States and much of Europe and much of the rest of the industrialized countries, that is often assumed to be the case. But there are a variety of cultures, both historically and at present, where if romantic love is part of the marriage, that is a good thing and probably expected to be something that will eventually develop in the context of the marriage. However, that is not seen as sort of the primary basis for which people get married, or the why of how they get married or how they pick their spouse. So I hope that those four case studies kind of illustrated both the common themes in marriage, but also just how diverse marriage can be. And in fact, for us as anthropologists with marriage, it's one of those things that it's a cultural universal. We can point to every culture on earth and see something that looks like what we think marriage is. So marriage, of course, is an English word, but that's true of most of the words that we're using, right? But actually, like some words like shamanism, which comes out of Evenki language in Siberia, like the word taboo, which comes specifically out of Polynesian cultures. Marriage is a term we're using, an English term, as anthropologists to characterize something that we see across all cultures. But what is that thing that we see? And in answering that question, we run into something called that I like to call the penguin bat conundrum. Not this penguin bat conundrum of why would Batman ever spend his time battling the penguin who's seriously overmatched. No, this penguin bat problem. If I was to have you define birds based on the birds you've seen, we might get a range of definitions. And so if we defined it too narrowly and said, well, it's these animals that fly and are warm-blooded and so forth, then we would exclude penguins, who are, of course, birds. However, if we defined it too broadly and were to count, well, warm-blooded and fly, but not anything else, not put in eggs or feathers, we would also be including bats, who are, of course, warm-blooded and fly. So the challenge in developing a cross-cultural definition of marriage, as with any cross-cultural term, is how do we capture the penguins but not accidentally include the bats? How do we define the term such that it shows exactly what we're talking about and what we're trying to point to, but doesn't include outliers that don't really fit? So part of what this lecture is thinking about, when we say that marriage is a cultural universal, what is it that we're actually pointing to that we implicitly understand in our minds to be marriage? The way we often think of marriage, I would say in the United States, it depends on the subculture we're from, or specific, perhaps, nations of origin or religious groups and different things. But generally speaking, the most common, what I would call hegemonic idea of marriage, is that we think of marriage as something where two people choose to get married because they love each other and they want to start a life together, right? That's the basis of our rom-coms. That's the basis of the many romantic holiday movies that we'll be inundated with in about a month on things like the Hallmark Channel or even Netflix. The idea that we get married primarily because of a motivation of love, I found my soulmate, things like that. And the assumption is that unless work compels them otherwise, generally if people are married, they live together, and that they will tend to, not always, but tend to have or adopt children together, that they may move away from the respective parents, that they'll tend to establish their own household, not always, but typically. And finally, we have the assumption that generally speaking, people don't marry their relatives, their close relatives. Those are all fair assumptions as sort of a folk model of marriage that fits for most American marriages. However, as an assumption of what marriage is, it kind of falls flat on its face when we try to apply it to all cultures around the world, because so many cultures don't fit those key assumptions. And indeed, much of what we assume a marriage is in the United States reflects the fact that if you think of any culture as lying on a spectrum from collectivist to individualist, some cultures are much more focused on the collective or the group well-being. Some are much more focused on the individual well-being and fulfillment. No culture is fully one or the other, right? Every culture cares to some degree about groups and families and things like that. And every culture thinks of individuals as at least a little bit important, but cultures kind of vary on how much they emphasize one or the other across the spectrum, right? And I would say that the US is a really culturally diverse, pluralistic place. But if we think of it as a place where there are many cultures and then also sort of a culture across the whole that tends to be sort of wider American culture, we tend to be fairly individualist oriented. Just walk through sort of the self-help aisle of a local bookstore and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Generally speaking, we focus a lot on the well-being of individuals and the fulfillment of individuals and our own truths and things like that. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's really reflected in how we think of marriage, right? People choosing to get married to sort of fulfill myself as an individual. I found my soulmate, right? Us two together, we will be happy, right? So it's focused on two individuals finding happiness together. And then we potentially split as soon as that happiness feels like it's fully extinguished, if it does. These are assumptions that have a lot to do with us as individuals. Same thing with the idea of moving away, right? That you're now your own thing, not the part of the family you came from. You're sort of starting a new family. The reality across cultures is that it varies tremendously. People get married for all sorts of reasons, not just in the sense that individuals might get married for money or something, but also in the sense that cultures themselves have very different ideas of why people get married. Many societies, indeed the majority, historically accept polygamous marriages. It doesn't mean it is the majority form of marriage. Mathematically, given that roughly half of the global population is female and roughly half is male, generally speaking at birth, then that means that monogamy will by definition be the majority form of marriage. However, around 3/4 of societies historically, at least occasionally, allowed for polygamous marriages. Marriages also across cultures can vary a lot in what they're about. In a lot of cultures, they're as much or more about two families bonding together, and continuing their lines as they are about two individuals attaining satisfaction. So again, marriage, universal. What it is varies quite a bit. There's definitely general patterns, but what it is varies quite a bit. Not always done for romantic love, often more than two partners. May be hard to dissolve, may be easy to dissolve, may or may not involve some kind of a truly legal written ceremony, in part because not all societies have written law, right? Some are regulated by oral tradition and other things, other forms of law. So a good example of a marriage system that looks pretty different than most US marriages is, of course, the Maasai. You read about this in the reading, but to expand a bit upon that and maybe share examples of what Maasai marriage is more generally, and not just in this sort of extreme example where in a situation of dire economics, they were trying to, the father was choosing to sort of try to compel his daughter to marry economically up, right? So that's kind of an example of marriage, Maasai marriage, in an extreme instance in the modern day under economic stress. However, more generally and traditionally, Maasai marriage is very distinctive in that historically, a lot of times it was arranged not just by a single father like that, but by the elders in general, the elder males of a village. So elder people who would get together and talk about who they think should be marrying in the village, so long as those people got along reasonably well, who they thought would be good matches. It was polygynous, by which I mean one man with multiple women. And generally speaking, it was regarded as permanent, not just in the sense that people were not supposed to get divorced, if at all possible, but also in the sense that even after husband's passing, women were expected not to remarry, which is very, very different than the United States. And then to add one more wrinkle on it, given all of this, we would say, well, that sounds like a very patriarchal, male-oriented culture. But one surprising aspect of this that sort of, yes, but kind of goes in a different direction is that the woman, the wife, she stays a part of her own lineage and is still very much a part of her own family, more so than thought of as part of the husband's family, which is interesting and different. So the Maasai are a good example of how marriage can be really different across cultures. There are some essential elements, like I said, some things that we can kind of point to and say that's always or almost always part of what these things we're calling that we're lumping under the marriage term. One of them is approved sexual intimacy and expectation of fidelity, the idea that these two people will be intimate together and won't be intimate with other people, although how serious that's taken varies by culture. You have kind of a spectrum of everything from nations like Afghanistan, where intimacy with somebody outside of your marriage can be punishable by imprisonment or other penalties, or nations where it's punishable by death. You have extremes like that. To the other opposite end, you have cultures like what I mentioned before with the Kulina, studied by my mentor, Don Pollock, where people don't like it when somebody cheats on them, but it is understood to be a pretty common scenario. More of a embarrassment and an annoyance than something that necessarily is unheard of or uncommon and would end the marriage de facto. Certainly not something that society as a whole would punish in that way. Another really common thing with marriage, though, is that, and probably the most common really, is the idea that any children that result either through birth or through adoption are seen as products of that union. We sometimes say that it legitimizes them, although I don't love that term. Because of the sort of moral valuation that it seems to imply, although admittedly in many cultures there is a moral valuation and judgment going on. But more specifically, to speak anthropologically, the idea would be that the children are sort of the heirs of the parents, right? If there's an idea of lineage, if there's an idea of sort of inheriting of wealth, if there's an idea of inheriting of like sacred objects, such as there is in a lot of cultures, such as Hopi, such as Tlingit, marriage sort of establishes who are the children of that marriage and therefore the inheritors of those things, and or the members of those things. And then also sort of an expectation of permanency, though I say ish because there are some cultures where divorce is much, much easier than others. You have, again, kind of a spectrum here. You have nations like Italy, for example, where you're supposed to have a trial separation of several years before divorce happens. At least that was the case about 15 years ago. Not sure if Italy's marriage laws have changed at all. That actually sounds a lot like covenant marriage practices in the United States. You have a type of legal marriage called covenant marriage in 3 states. One is Arizona, one is Louisiana. the current Speaker of the House. There's been several news articles because he is in one of these. That's the kind of marriage that he was married under, among other things. In covenant marriages in the US, it's expected that there would be a trial separation of, I think, 2 years prior to a marriage dissolving. So you have stuff like that where marriages are pretty hard to dissolve. And then you have the other extreme. Historically, in Hopi society prior to colonialism, allegedly, it was as simple as sort of putting the husband's boots and staff outside of the house to say, we are divorced now. And it was not uncommon. I shouldn't say that it was not uncommon. It was not difficult in that regard. You have groups like the Mosu in Africa, or in China, where historically they practiced something that's sometimes called walking marriage, where basically to be married, you find somebody that you want to be with and you go and start living together. And then when you're done being married to them, you walk to another place, to another home, so to speak. And so marriage is readily available and readily dissolvable. And so it's not always permanent in the sense of like super long lasting, although most cultures think of marriage as something that should last many, many years, if not the entire life of those involved. Marriage varies, though, in a lot of ways. One of the ways that it varies is in why it's done. One is the selection of the spouses, how that's done. One is the number of spouses. One is the economic factors, and other ways as well. So I want to talk about each of those. First of all, when we think about marriage, again, why do people get married? I liked some of these quotes from the reading. So, for example, when Medius, this is from the New Guinea example, when he gives this new bundle of gifts to his bride's family, they'll spread those gifts through their network. By the logic of the gift economy, these people will give back, and a large cycle of giving will be created that unites two large networks that intersect at the new node created by the union of the bride and groom. So the primary reason they're getting married is because they clearly like each other, thus them sneaking off into the bushes together. However, one of the things that marriage does, and arguably an important benefit of it, and why the whole bride wealth thing is going on there, is that it brings about circles of trading, celebration, and exchange going on, like with the village of people that was trying to outcompete them with giving more fruit. But then you contrast that with, among Maasai, marriage is understood and valued as an alliance of families, another quote from the reading. And so in this case, it kind of helps build an alliance, but the main purpose is still love. But in the Maasai case, marriage, maybe potentially that might be one of the primary reasons, is that it's thought of as an alliance of families. Also, in the example of Esther, particularly as economic situation for the Maasai in Kenya has become more difficult, as pastoralism has become more difficult, marriage is sort of a way of securing the economic future of children, of making sure that they marry somebody who's wealthy and well off, which in this case, as it would often be the case when one is trying to marry someone wealthy, would tend to be somebody that's older, which brings its own set of concerns. And then this final quote, the basic explanation, talking about the Tamu Nadu case, the anthropologist that studied it says the basic explanation for this is that marriage is too important to be left to chance individual attraction. In fact, a child's marriage is the most important and often most expensive decision a South Asian family ever has to make. So the idea that although it would be good for the individuals to get along well together. In fact, I was talking to a guy from India the other day, and we were talking about that, and he had an arranged marriage, and he was saying, oh yeah, like it's worked super well, partly because our families knew each other and they tried to pair us well together, and they did. It worked out really well for him. But the point here is that although that's something to consider, it's not the only thing to consider, right? There's a whole lot of wealth to think about. There's a whole lot of families that will have to interact for the next 6 decades, right? There's all sorts of other things going on here other than just individuals being fulfilled. So you don't leave that just up to individual romantic love. As another example, in the book Culture, Performance, and Communication in Iran by the anthropologist Wilman Beeman, he says, Iranian families are close-knit, extended, and loyal. It's often said that when two people decide to marry, it's really their families that are marrying. A man has binding claims on his brother's wife's cousins and vice versa. He can drop in on them unannounced and stay as long as he likes as a welcome guest. For this reason, great care is taken to make certain of an elaborate network of compatibilities at the time of marriage, not compatibilities of the individuals, although again, that would be the hope, but compatibilities of the families, that the families get along well together. And so people marry, cultures marry, we should say, sometimes for romantic love is the main purpose, sometimes the main purpose being to bring families together, sometimes for the main purpose being to make sure that there's a division of labor that the two spouses are doing different things. So it's not one person expected to do all tasks that come with child rearing, with making a living, with obtaining food. Often in many cultures, the idea is that first and foremost, it's about ensuring that there will be a couple or more than a couple who are good at parenting together, and that it will ensure the propagation, the continuation of that culture of these family lines, right? It's about a lot more than solely sort of romantic intimacy. Cultures vary also in who they choose to marry, or rather, there are rules of how you pick who you marry. No culture is a free-for-all. No culture says you can marry anybody, but there's all sorts of different ways that this gets dealt with. Every culture has rules of exogamy. Exogamy means you marry outside of a group. And I say that every culture has that because every culture has what we sometimes call the incest taboo, which is a fancy anthropological term for every culture has some concept of the idea of incest and that we don't marry within kin, that we are too closely related to. However, that can get defined very differently depending on the culture. So, for example, historically in Tlingit culture, you had moieties and clans. A moiety is like a division of a culture into two, in this case, like raven and eagle, or raven and wolf. And then clans would be within that additional divisions of people that, and these clans, as well as these moieties, are exogamous, by which I mean you marry outside of your clan. And so because of that, there is a lot of people who you're too closely related to be married to through your clan, but those may be people that are from the perspective of genealogy, sort of your third cousin or fourth cousin or something, from the perspective, or even more distant. So in the US, in many states, that would be perfectly legal to marry and may even be perfectly acceptable in the ideas of a lot of people to marry. Traditionally, in that part of the world, specifically Southeast Alaska, that would have been not allowed, right? For a lot of, if somebody was the same clan as you. Nowadays, things are somewhat different, but that was the idea historically and until very recently. In the US, in about half of states, it is legal to marry your first or second cousin. In about half of states, that's illegal. What might surprise you is the distribution of those states. It is often assumed that cousin marriage is more common in the US South. And although that is true of some of the southern states that it is legal, there are also several of the southern states where it is illegal and very uncommon. And some of the states where it is legal are actually places like the Northeast and Canada and Alaska and Hawaii. So it's kind of interesting what the laws actually say. The other interesting thing is that there are a few states where cousin marriage is illegal unless you can prove that the likelihoods of having children together are non-existent or extremely unlikely, such as you're of a certain age or medical condition where it would be extremely unlikely to conceive. And then you were allowed to marry close cousin. Obviously, American laws about marriage reflect certain ideas about genetics or blood and the idea that people that are too closely related will cause birth defects. However, it is worth noting that many cultures do practice cousin marriage. In fact, we have a term for this because in some cultures that's actually a preferred form of marriage, as with the Tamu Nadu example that you read about. So we call that preferential cousin marriage. Usually, many cultures that do this, they'll distinguish between cross cousins and parallel cousins. Parallel cousins, again, being through your mother's brother or through your father's sister. So that would be your cross cousin because you're crossing between the two, those two sexes. Whereas, so that would be your cross cousin. Your parallel would be your father's brother's kids or your mother's sister's kids. Those are cross cousins. And in some cultures, only parallel cousin marriage is allowed, and in a few cultures in a lot of cultures, only cross cousin marriage is allowed. In a few cultures, only parallel marriage is allowed. But in any case, cousin marriage, not unheard of across the world. In fact, pretty common in some parts of the world, Tamu Nadu being just one of many examples. It makes sense for a lot of reasons, including if you think of it from the context of arranged marriage and also from the context of societies where marriage is seen as uniting two families together and not just two people. From that perspective, this allows for marriages where the families know each other extremely well already and can determine usually if A, the couple will get together or the couple will get along well, and B, if the family will get along well, which typically they will because they're already relatives. It also, in some cases, keeps wealth within the family, which can also be a consideration. So not uncommon historically. There are even examples for those of you who are from faith traditions that read the Bible or the Tanakh or the Quran. There's lots of examples from there of cousin marriage, for example. Abraham's marriage to Sarah and Jacob's marriage to Rachel and Leah are both cousin marriages in the book of Genesis. So not uncommon historically. You might wonder why that doesn't lead to like sort of widespread major birth defects like we sometimes would assume in the US. And the fact of the matter is that the genetics of this are far more complicated and less, to be blunt, less serious than we tend to assume. If it's done systemically over and over and over again, it can cause genetic issues because recessives sort of accumulate, so to speak. You can see that with the Habsburg family of monarchs in Europe, where you had cousins marrying each other over many generations. But if it's done here and there, but also you have marriages of non-cousins regularly enough, it's really not a thing that causes like huge birth defects or anything like that. That's just kind of a misunderstanding. That's how we assumed it worked back in the 1800s, and our marriage laws sort of reflect that in a lot of states still. Again, arranged marriage, not uncommon across cultures. I would say it's less common than common, but still it's a large minority of cultures, if that makes sense. The nature of how arranged it is varies tremendously. The example you had of Esther among the Messiah is one where it sounds downright coercive, but in a lot of cultures, including historically a lot of times in Messiah culture, but also in a lot of other cultures, it's sort of arranged marriage with a certain amount of say-so from the individuals, or even sometimes it's the individuals sort of initially make a connection and then bring it before the families, who then sort of have a veto power, as you were sort of seeing with the Papua New Guinea example with the two kids that not two kids, I shouldn't say that, but two teenagers that snuck off together. You see interesting examples of how arranged marriage gets articulated in sort of a modern urban context. And so, for example, in places like Beijing and urban centers of China, where traditionally arranged marriage was very common, you often have matchmakers, and this becomes doubly so because of the sex ratio skewing in China, where you have more males than females. And so matchmaker services are often hired where you have a matchmaker, and a matchmaker sort of steps in to help arrange dates and get people hopefully married off with a partner that matches them pretty well. And it sort of reflects ancient practices of arranged marriages between families, but that doesn't really work very well if we're moving around to different cities now in this kind of modern, fast-paced, specialized economy like China or other industrialized nations have. So people are a lot of times not living as close to their family. And so instead of the matchmaker service, this professional that you hire who has like literally a portfolio of potential spouses for you, kind of steps in as this like different kind of thing. And you can see that similar things on like even like Netflix shows like Indian Matchmaker or Jewish Matchmaker. I don't normally recommend Netflix shows as like a be all end all ethnographic source. I wouldn't like cite it in an academic paper, but both of those TV shows kind of show examples of like modern professional matchmakers sort of stepping into a role that traditionally probably would have been fulfilled by parents. Number of, certainly in the Indian Matchmaker example, number of partners is another way in which marriages can vary a lot across cultures. And so historically, or not historically, that's the wrong way of saying it. We have a few different terms to explain what we mean by the number of partners involved in a marriage, because of course monogamy is not the only option here. Polygamy is where it's multiple spouses beyond two. We have a few different terms within that. Polygyny for multiple wives, from gynos, which is a Greek prefix that often refers to women. Polyandry from Greek prefix andros, which often refers to men. Polyandry, multiple husbands. Between these three systems, and it's actually more than three systems, because we could also list group marriage, where it's multiple husbands, multiple wives, and that starts to sound essentially like a legally codified version of polyamory, which of course has become more popular in recent years in the United States, or at least more widely talked about. But monogamy is by far and away still the most common form of marriage across the world, which makes sense given, again, the roughly 50-50 ratio of men and women across cultures, with certain exceptions. However, it has become more common in the sense that more and more cultures require that as the only form of marriage, partly due to the influence of colonialism and modernity. As colonial powers spread, they often enforced monogamous marriages because it better matched Christian marriage practices, as well as just, even religion aside, European religious or marriage practices, generally speaking, monogamous, and that was sort of enforced around the world. And that then, even after the European powers gave up power over much of the world, in the wake of revolutions, oftentimes those laws or those cultural norms had become now permanent. And so, for example, in much of North and South America, polygamy was common in many cultures across North and South America, not all by any stretch, but many. But it is now effectively illegal across the Western Hemisphere. In places like Africa, Southern Asia, Southwest Asia, or the Middle East, much more common to be legally allowed, sometimes with various restrictions, such as by number of spouses, such as the Islamic prohibition against more than 4 spouses, or such as in India, only Muslims can engage in polygamy. So polygyny, again, one husband, multiple wives, we tend to, and then polyandry, multiple husbands, one wife. The most commonly known example is Tibetan fraternal polyandry, where you have multiple brothers and one wife, and the child is typically thought of as sort of a child of all of the fathers, even if you can usually tell who the dad is, because if only one dad was around at the time, if the other brothers were traveling or something, but generally speaking, the child is sort of treated as the child of the whole polygamous union rather than just one of the fathers. Pretty rare cross-culturally, less than 1%, although probably more common historically than we think. As once I got to Alaska and started reading up more on Alaskan ethnographies, I was surprised by that there were several cultures that I came across where polyandry was allowed historically that I had never heard about during my getting a doctorate in anthropology. So there's sometimes places where it was practiced historically that aren't as well known unless you sort of do a deep dive into the historical records. But even still, even accounting for that, polyandry historically is pretty uncommon. Polygyny, much more common. One study done in 1957 that sort of took samples from each of the continents. About 75% of the cultures allowed for polygyny. Doesn't mean that that was widespread, but it at least allowed for it. People tend to believe that that is because of men having a higher sex drive, in addition to the fact that, scientifically speaking, that's a bit debatable, and it depends on the individual, of course, but probably more so the challenge with that as a theory to explain it is that that's not almost ever how people explain it when you actually interview people in cultures where polygamy is widespread. And even in situations where that would be an okay thing to say, polygamy is widespread, it is accepted and common, people almost never mention sort of, oh, because I love multiple people or I'm attracted to multiple people. That's almost never discussed. Instead, what anthropologists have found, as well as journalists, as they go around to these cultures, is that it is much more common that people bring up status or even more commonly wealth. So for example, there's this quote, I think it might have been in the reading, but the anthropologist is talking to a guy in Papua New Guinea, and he's like, oh, like, why polygamy, why multiple wives? And he says, oh, well, of course, so that we can have like a larger pig herd, right? So traditionally in his culture, women took care of the pig herds while men did more of like the hunting and forest clearing. And so, but pigs were really important as like a marker of wealth for a household. So having multiple women in one household meant a much larger pig herd, more prestige and honor for not just the man, but also the women involved in this. So you could see how both the man and the women in this scenario would be desirous of being in a household like that because it would be one that would be wealthier. In another reading that I have sometimes have people do called African polygyny, they do interviews with a variety of people in polygynous cultures. And one of the things that one of the women mentions is like, oh, well, I like it because more wealth and easier, like more people to divide the labor among, and then also more people that can contribute to the household economy. So some cultures will bring up like reproductive advantage. In other words, they'll sometimes bring up like, well, so-and-so is a really good person, and therefore this allows them to have more children than they would have from a monogamous marriage. So polygamy historically not uncommon across cultures. The reasons, though, almost never attributed to multiple romance, although we do see isolated examples of that. Of course, when Americans hear about these cultures that do practice polygamy, they tend to wonder, what about competition? That's certainly what I had always wondered. What about jealousy, right? How do you all get along? And that totally makes sense. Jealousy is a normal human emotion, although it's worth pointing out that that normal human emotion is further heightened when you think of marriage primarily as about finding a soulmate and that there's only one soulmate for everybody. So you could see how people would view love in that way as very much exclusive to two people. How in cultures that do practice polygamy, it is very common that there's a variety of checks and balances in place to try to reduce jealousy. and reduce competition. One of them is the practice of sororal polygyny, and as with Tibet, fraternal polyandry, meaning marriage of multiple brothers or marriage of multiple sisters, where generally speaking, they know each other already. And so it is expected that they would get along better. Of course, sometimes siblings don't get along well at all, but at least they would know each other, and that would decrease the problems, which goes along with a broader pattern that oftentimes the way these things are made to be less competitive is that the spouse is the one where there's multiple, either if it's polyandry, the husbands, or if it's polygyny, the wives, they know each other and may have even had a strong hand in picking who the spouses were. So in a lot of cultures that practice polygyny, the first wife either has to approve or is actually the one that suggests who the second wife is. A third thing that tends to be practiced in polygamous cultures, in a variety of indigenous cultures across the world, is that there tends to be, this is not universal, but a lot of times there will be separate households for different spouses, so that nobody sort of feels like their domestic space is infringed on, which in a lot of cultures where marriage is less about love and more about sort of building a life, a household, wealth, children together, sharing a household might be actually more problematic than sharing who you're intimate with. So food for thought. Another way cultures vary a lot in terms of marriage is what we sometimes call marriage compensation, or wealth exchange. So when we think about what a marriage costs, right? A marriage can cost very little or it can cost a lot. Different families vary in how much they spend on a marriage. My marriage was relatively low cost, although from our point of view, it was still plenty expensive. Some families spend tens of thousands of dollars on a marriage, right? It really depends. Across cultures worldwide, though, there are patterns of wealth exchange that wouldn't really put American weddings, generally speaking, to shame. Many cultures practice bride wealth, which is not really a gift from the groom to the bride's family, although that's often how it's spoken of, but it's really typically more from the groom's family as a whole to the bride's family as a whole. Bride service is the same idea, but instead of wealth being transferred, it's labor. So, for example, the husband-to-be will spend years or maybe just months working for the potential bride, or rather for her family. Dowry is the reverse, where it's gifts from the bride's family to the groom's. That is most common in patriarchal hypogamous societies. What I mean by that is where you have a patriarchal society where the men, generally speaking, are more in control of the wealth or more produce the wealth, but then hypogamy in the sense that a woman is marrying somebody of more wealth than her own family. In a situation like that, there tends to be more often dowries. It's also more common in matrilocal societies for an entirely different reason, and actually an almost opposite reason, which is that if the husband is coming to live with the wife's family, matrilocal, that's what that means. If the husband's coming to live with the wife's family, then the husband's family has sort of lost somebody who could have worked in their household. They've suffered an economic loss, so the dowry sort of compensates them for the loss. So dowry is seen in a lot of different places. It's less common than bride wealth, but it is seen in several different cultures worldwide. Common historically in India and Pakistan, also common historically in Ireland. The logic of it, what is the reason? Well, much like polygamy, there's the assumption people sometimes have, if they're not from a culture that does this, of, oh, well, it's purchasing the right to marry a spouse. But it is worth pointing out that when people are interviewed, or when we observe it as anthropologists with long-term fieldwork, it's rarely seen as like a selling or a purchasing. Instead, people have other ideas of what it's for, or it's clear that it's doing different things for a society. One of the biggest of which is that it compensates for losses. Specifically, if you are a family in many societies, that's not just your family, that's who you work with, that's who you farm with, or that's who you herd with, or that's who you hunt with and gather with. So when a family group has lost a partner because they've married into a different family group, bride wealth or dowry serves to sort of compensate the family that has lost someone. Specifically, bride wealth might be more common for a variety of reasons, including that not only has a family lost a daughter, but they, in a sense, I mean, not literally lost a daughter, but like lost her as a member of the household that contributes to the household. But not only have they lost a daughter, they've also, in a sense, lost any children she might have had, right? Generations. So bride wealth then is more common than dowry, potentially for that reason. It also strengthens kinship bonds, and a lot of times, especially sometimes, you'll have reciprocal gift giving, like among the Trobriand Islanders, there will be yam gifts that go back and forth and jewelry gifts that go back and forth. Ultimately, it's more of a bride wealth system because it's like a 7-stage process of giving gifts, and ultimately, though arguably the wife's family gets more than the groom's family. However, there's really just gift giving back and forth. And if you think about what gift giving is anthropologically, we think of gifts giving as something that doesn't just give wealth, but gives emotion, right? We attach emotions to gifts. There's a great book called Producing Guanxi by Andrew Kipnis about gift giving in China, both among families and among business partners. And it really gets into this idea of how much emotions are involved with gift giving and how gift giving in many cultures builds emotions. So bride, wealth, and dowry then are a way of bringing families together. It can also, as in the Papua New Guinea example, test if people are ready to be married, if they have a wide enough network that they can mobilize wealth. And it also, or if they're old enough to have accumulated enough wealth. It also tends to reduce the likelihood of divorce. Of course, there's a lot of other factors at play in cultures that do this, so you can't just say it's only that. But in some cultures where bride wealth is refundable, where you lose the bride, the groom's family, or sorry, the bride's family loses the wealth if there's a divorce, they have to give it back to the groom's family. In a scenario like that, you could see the common sense reason for why family members, unless it's a terrible marriage, if it's only just a kind of rocky marriage that's having some issues, maybe a bit of squabbling or something, you could understand how family members might strongly encourage the people to stay married and maybe even try to help them stay married, counsel with them, because there's wealth on the line, right? And they'd have to give wealth that may already have been spent. And so there's some practical aspects to that. And now I've been talking about sort of all these positive or at least sort of functional, right, things that it does to maintain a society's cohesion. But it is worth pointing out when we talk about bride, wealth, and dowry that it can also be dysfunctional, that it can also cause serious problems. This is uncommon culturally. This is very, very, very uncommon culturally. Even where it is seen, it is mathematically uncommon compared to the number of total marriages. It is very uncommon. However, it does number in the thousands every year. So it's a significant human right concern, something we call dowry deaths, where in India and Pakistan, you have instances where people, the dowry wasn't enough, or the bride's family did not pay the dowry that they promised they would, or situations like that. And it's a situation where wives move into husbands' homes and live with his extended family. So you have a situation where parents have, in effect, somebody new to be provided for in the home, right? An additional mouth to feed, as it were. But typically, especially in a situation where it's typically the husband who has a job outside the home, then it's a situation where like the dowry becomes important, especially if somebody's marrying up, quote unquote, marrying somebody more wealthy than them. And so what we call hypogamy. So in a situation where you have patriarchy, patrilocality, and hypogamy, that's a lot of fancy words together, you then have the really tragic circumstance of when dowry's not enough, some people that are unethical will either threaten or actually commit murder as a result of that. And so that's a really serious human rights concern. It's really not so much a religion thing as a regional thing, because it's found in both Pakistan and India, which of course one is Hindu majority and one is Muslim majority. So it is sort of a regional practice, or not practice, that's the wrong word, a regional tragedy. And it's one that governments have tried to fight. So in India, it's outlawed to do dowries as a prerequisite of marriage. However, families have ways of sort of skirting the law and getting around that. And unfortunately, dowry deaths still happen to this day. So finally, cultures can vary a lot in terms of how common and easy divorce is. Again, I talked about Italy, where trial separation before a marriage can dissolve. Hoping where a divorce before colonialism was much easier. So it varies a lot across cultures. You have groups like the Mosao, who historically, again, marriage is as simple as walking out the door, or sorry, divorce is as simple as walking out the door. And so much so that some anthropologists would debate whether that classifies as a marriage system or not. But while we're talking about divorce, it's worth pointing out that you've probably all heard the commonly cited statistic that 50% of marriages end in divorce in the United States. That is a wrong statistic, and it is a good example of people circulating wrong statistics, which happens all the time. In 2014, they did a study that showed that people of that current generation, which was basically millennials at the time, and older Gen Zers, that these people predicted that about 70% would stay together based on current marriage trends. So about 2/3 of marriages. Given that, why then this idea of 50% of marriages end in divorce? It's actually a kind of complex and interesting story. Back in the 70s, rates of divorce were skyrocketing, in part because of the spread of no-fault divorce laws. So in many states previous to this, you had to prove to the judge why you needed a divorce, such as infidelity or abuse. In the 60s, 70s, you had the spread of, in states, the spread of no-fault divorce laws, where you don't have to prove something like that to get divorced. It may be relevant in the divorce settlement of wealth, but just to get a divorce, you don't have to prove that, or you can just say irreconcilable differences, or just we're getting divorced. And so in the wake of that, many couples that got divorced, and divorce rates were seemingly skyrocketing, and social scientists predicted where they thought that was going. And they predicted that by sort of like the 90s, we'd be at a 50-50, 50% of marriages ending in divorce. But what actually happened is that the number stabilized over time. Try to predict what society's going to do, and society's going to laugh at you. So anyways, the divorce rate stabilized over time. So arguably, we were never at a 50-50 divorce ratio, and we're certainly not now. If anything, that rate has gone down over time for a variety of reasons, including people marrying older and being less likely to sort of marry solely for social pressure. So yeah, not 50% of marriages do not end in divorce, and that's a dumb statistic. Okay. So if anybody ever cites that to you when if you decide to get married, just slap them in the face and say, that's a bad statistic. Just kidding. Don't slap people. So then when we look across cultures, then one anthropologist defines marriage as a socially recognized relationship that may involve physical and emotional intimacy, as well as legal rights to property and inheritance, and then I added, which often formalizes the rearing of children. So in some ways, remarkably different across cultures. In some ways, I guess, remarkably similar. And the fact that it is so widespread and a cultural universal says a lot about human beings, including the fact that, back to sort of the beginning of this kinship lecture, humans are very much a species where children depend on essentially being enculturated, right? Trained, educated within the home for 15 to 20 years, depending on the culture, or more, and that marriage is often the way that a culture most centrally solves that particular biological problem or need, is by having this sort of socially recognized union that we call marriage. All right, thank you very much for your time.